Long before the Romanov dynasty collapsed, one woman inside the family reportedly sensed the danger gathering beyond the palace gates. Grand Duchess Olga did not merely fear revolution, she believed her brother's throne was being quietly dismantled from within, one fatal decision at a time. Olga Alexandrovna had been born into a world most people could barely imagine, a world of inherited titles, guarded rooms, sacred rituals, and unquestioned obedience. She was the younger sister of Emperor Nicholas II, yet she never seemed entirely at ease with the performance of royalty. Beneath the jewels, formal dinners, and carefully controlled conversations, Olga sensed something hollow. The court demanded perfection, but she noticed the cracks. She was not a minister, strategist, or public rebel. Her power came from watching. She listened when servants lowered their voices. She remembered the unease hidden inside polite conversations. She noticed when officers spoke with less confidence, when reports from distant estates carried more bitterness than reassurance, and when ordinary Russians began speaking of the monarchy not with devotion, but with anger. Inside the palace, such warnings were dangerous. Fear was treated as disloyalty. Doubt could sound like betrayal. The imperial family had been trained to believe that dignity meant silence, and that appearances could hold back reality. Olga knew better. She understood that the greatest threat was not one revolutionary leader waiting in the shadows. It was the growing belief that the Romanovs no longer understood the people they ruled. That realization tore at her. Nicholas was not merely the emperor to her. He was her brother, a man she loved, trusted, and wanted to protect. But his devotion to tradition had become a blindfold. He believed the throne had survived unrest before and would survive again. Olga feared that each reassurance only pushed him further from the truth. She reportedly tried to speak carefully, warning him that the mood had changed, that loyalty could not be inherited forever, and that the silence surrounding him was not peace. But rank carried more weight than instinct, and comforting voices were easier to accept than frightening ones. Olga could see the danger clearly. The tragedy was that seeing it gave her no power to stop it. Yet the unrest outside the palace was only one part of Olga's fear, because the decision she believed was weakening Nicholas most dangerously was being made inside his own family. Olga's deepest concern was not simply that Russia was turning against the throne. It was that the throne itself had become trapped inside a private world of fear, illness, secrecy, and spiritual dependence, and at the center of that world stood Empress Alexandra and the mysterious figure the court refused to control. Olga's tension with Alexandra was never merely a matter of personality. It came from two completely different ways of facing danger. Olga trusted directness, practical judgment, and uncomfortable truth. Alexandra, increasingly isolated by fear for her son, retreated deeper into secrecy. Alexei's illness was not only a private heartbreak. It became the hidden force shaping the imperial household, turning every decision into a desperate attempt to protect the fragile heir. The secrecy surrounding the boy created distance. Ministers were kept outside. Relatives were told only what the family wished them to know. Public suspicion grew in the empty spaces where honest explanation should have been. And into that atmosphere came Grigory Rasputin. To Olga, Rasputin represented something far more dangerous than scandal. Whether every rumor about him was true no longer mattered. His name had become proof, in the public mind, that judgment inside the palace had collapsed. Yet warnings were dismissed as envy, gossip, or political attack. Even when senior relatives expressed alarm, Alexandra saw criticism as cruelty, while Nicholas treated loyalty to his wife as a sacred duty. Olga understood his trap. If Nicholas challenged Alexandra, he risked shattering the emotional center of his family. If he defended her without question, he appeared blind before the nation. But she also knew that hesitation was becoming its own decision. She reportedly pressed him in private. urging him to see that the crisis was no longer about one mystic or one frightened mother. It was about what Russia believed. And belief, once poisoned, could become more powerful than fact. Around them, the Romanovs began dividing. Some defended the imperial couple with fierce loyalty. Others whispered that intervention was no longer betrayal, but necessity. Olga stood between them, increasingly alone, watching love turn into suspicion and family concern harden into faction. Her warning to Nicholas was devastatingly simple. If he continued protecting the family's secrets at the cost of the monarchy's credibility, he might lose both. Then Europe descended into war, and the cracks Olga had noticed inside the dynasty were forced open before an entire empire. When war began, the Romanovs expected patriotism to rescue the throne. Olga feared the opposite. She believed every battlefield defeat, every empty food cart, and every grieving family would be laid at Nicholas's feet, and when the emperor made one astonishing decision, her private dread became certainty. At first, the war seemed to silence every criticism. Crowds rallied around the monarchy, flags appeared, and old divisions were briefly buried beneath patriotic excitement. But Olga understood how fragile that unity was. A nation could cheer in the beginning and still turn furious when victory failed to come. Her nursing work brought her closer to the truth than any polished report ever could. She heard the wounded speak without ceremony. Some had been sent forward without proper equipment. Others described confusion, hunger, and officers unable to explain why so many men had been sacrificed. Their pain carried more than exhaustion. It carried resentment. That anger was changing direction. Soldiers no longer blamed only distant commanders or careless ministers. Increasingly, they questioned the system above them. And at the top of that system stood Nicholas. Then came the decision Olga feared most. The emperor assumed personal command of the army, believing his presence would strengthen morale and prove his devotion. To him, it was courage. To Olga, it was a political trap. From that moment, every retreat, every shortage, and every grave could be connected directly to the throne. She knew her brother's heart. Nicholas wanted to carry the burden himself. But he had confused personal honor with national survival. By leaving the capital, he also left Alexandra exposed to deeper suspicion. Rumors of Rasputin's influence spread faster, while ministers appeared weak and the government seemed increasingly controlled by a frightened household. Olga tried to send warnings through relatives, hoping someone close enough to Nicholas could make him reconsider. But fear of confrontation paralyzed the family. No one wanted to be accused of disloyalty, and delay became its own form of surrender. Meanwhile, railway failures choked supplies. Bread grew scarce. Soldiers wondered why they were dying while their families waited in hunger. Olga saw the danger with brutal clarity. Once the army stopped believing in the emperor, nothing sacred could restore that loyalty. But while Russia bled, another struggle was unfolding inside the Romanov family, one involving loyalty, inheritance, and the terrifying question of who might replace Nicholas if the throne could no longer protect itself. By the final years of the monarchy, royal dinners had become exercises in silence, coded glances, and concealed panic. Olga began to suspect that some relatives were no longer discussing how to save Nicholas, but whether the empire could only be saved by removing him from power. The Romanov family was splitting under pressure. Senior relatives blamed Nicholas for refusing to change, and Alexandra for deepening his isolation. Behind closed doors, conversations grew sharper. Some spoke of dismissing ministers. Others wanted Alexandra pushed away from political influence. A few began whispering about a government strong enough to act without waiting for the emperor's approval. Olga stood in the middle of this widening fracture. Nicholas was her brother, and the thought of humiliating him filled her with pain. Yet defending him without question now felt equally dangerous. Every stubborn decision tightened the trap around the throne, and every relative offering salvation seemed to carry a private ambition. At the center of the uncertainty stood Alexei. The young heir's illness was more than a family secret. It made the succession frighteningly unstable. If Nicholas were forced aside, who would rule? Could a child so physically vulnerable inherit an empire in revolt? Would a regent govern in his name? Or would another Romanov branch attempt to seize control? Olga heard fragments of discussions that once would have been unthinkable. Regency, abdication, the transfer of authority, even the possibility that another Grand Duke might replace Nicholas. Each proposal was presented as a sacrifice for Russia. But Olga noticed how quickly duty became calculation. Those claiming to protect the dynasty were also measuring where they might stand after Nicholas fell. Then, conspiracy turned into bloodshed. Rasputin was murdered by men connected to the aristocratic world, men who believed violence could rescue the monarchy from itself. Olga's horror went beyond the death. The killing proved that trust inside the family had collapsed completely. Relatives were no longer confronting one another openly. They were acting in secret, deciding that their own judgment stood above the emperor's will. The dynasty had stopped behaving like one family guarding a throne. It had become a circle of frightened survivors, each trying to escape blame before the structure beneath them gave way. And still, they misunderstood the scale of the danger. The final blow would not come from a private gathering of Grand Dukes or a carefully arranged palace intervention. It would come from hungry streets, mutinous barracks, and railway lines the emperor could no longer command. And when the capital finally erupted, Olga's warnings were no longer whispers about what might happen, they became a countdown to an abdication she had feared for years. The Romanov dynasty did not end with a grand battle inside the Winter Palace. It collapsed through unanswered telegrams, mutinous regiments, abandoned trains, and frightened officials. For Olga, the most horrifying part was not the speed of the fall, it was how closely it followed the disaster she had predicted. The February Revolution began as hunger, exhaustion, and anger spilling beyond control. Breadlines became protests. Protests became defiance. Workers filled the streets, soldiers hesitated, and officials struggled to understand whether they were facing another temporary disturbance or the beginning of something far more dangerous. Conflicting reports reached the Romanovs from every direction. One message promised order would soon return. The next warned that entire districts had slipped from government control. Inside the family, confusion delayed action. They had spent years dismissing warnings, and now they could no longer tell which threat was real because every threat had arrived at once. Then came the moment Olga had feared. Troops ordered to suppress the crowds began refusing commands. Some joined the demonstrators, others turned against their officers. The army, the last great pillar beneath the throne, was breaking apart from within. Olga felt no satisfaction in being proved right, only terror. She had warned that the dynasty could not survive once soldiers stopped believing in Nicholas. Now that loyalty was collapsing faster than anyone could rebuild it, Nicholas attempted to return to the capital. But even the railways seemed to turn against him. Routes were blocked, trains were redirected, and political support disappeared with every delayed hour. The Emperor of Russia found himself isolated, unable to reach his own seat of power. Generals and political leaders pressed him to abdicate, insisting it was the only way to prevent military collapse and civil war. Then, Nicholas made the decision that shattered the future of his line. He surrendered the throne not only for himself, but for Alexei, the son whose inheritance had shaped so many of the family's secret choices. Power passed toward Grand Duke Michael, but Michael refused to accept the crown without public approval. In that refusal, centuries of Romanov rule ended with almost unbearable simplicity. No coronation oath, sacred title, or inherited jewel could restore what had vanished. Nicholas was no longer emperor. To Olga, however, he remained her brother, unprotected, exposed, and suddenly dependent on men who had once bowed before him. Her fear changed instantly. Saving the monarchy no longer mattered. Saving the family did. The crown was gone, but Olga understood that abdication had not ended the danger. It had removed the final shield between her family and those who wanted the Romanovs erased forever. Once Nicholas surrendered the throne, the Romanovs discovered a brutal truth. Without power, their name became a prison. Every palace turned into a guarded enclosure, every journey required permission, and every delay made escape less likely. Olga now feared the revolution would demand more than abdication. At first, the family remained surrounded by familiar rooms, but nothing about their lives was familiar anymore. Doors were watched. Letters were examined. Movements were restricted. The home that had once represented imperial authority had become a place of confinement, and every new order reduced their world further. Olga's fear centered on one question: would Nicholas, Alexandra, and the children be allowed to leave Russia before the political mood hardened against them? Possibilities of exile appeared, then vanished. Foreign governments hesitated, worried that offering refuge to the former emperor might provoke anger at home. To Olga, that hesitation felt like betrayal. Europe's royal houses were bound to the Romanovs by blood, marriage, and years of ceremony. Yet when protection mattered most, family ties suddenly seemed fragile. Even the family's jewels became dangerous. They could finance escape, secure loyalty, or provide a future in exile. But they could also be used as proof that the Romanovs remained wealthy enemies of a suffering nation. What once symbolized permanence now attracted suspicion. Olga urged relatives to act before another government took power, because each political shift brought more radical men closer to controlling Nicholas's fate. Yet some members of the extended family still argued over property, rank, and protocol, as though the old rules had survived. Olga could barely contain her anger. Children were in danger, and people who claimed to love them were still measuring titles. As revolutionary power hardened, Nicholas ceased to be merely a deposed ruler. He became a hostage whose name might inspire loyalists, foreign intervention, or a counter-revolution. Olga understood what others refused to face. Their captors did not simply want him contained. They wanted to make certain the Romanov name could never gather power again. Then came the transfer farther east. Ekaterinburg was not just another place of detention. To Olga, it marked the moment ordinary rescue became almost impossible. Distance swallowed every plan. Communication weakened. Letters became rare, uncertain, and heavily controlled. She no longer knew what Nicholas understood, what he had been told, or whether he still believed release was possible. That silence became its own warning. Then, the messages stopped, the rumors became darker, and Olga was forced to confront the possibility that the warning she had carried for years was about to end in an act even she had struggled to imagine. For weeks, no one could tell Olga the truth. Some claimed Nicholas had been moved. Others insisted the family was alive under secret protection. But beneath the contradictory reports, one terrifying silence remained, and Olga began to understand that the Romanovs had vanished into a darkness carefully designed to leave no witnesses. Every fragment of news carried both hope and terror. One report suggested Nicholas was still alive. Another claimed only he had been killed. Then came whispers that Alexandra and the children had been taken somewhere safer. Olga seized upon each possibility, even as she understood why the revolutionary authorities might hide the truth. Confusion protected them. Uncertainty delayed outrage. Silence allowed horror to settle before anyone could challenge it. Rumors spread that one of the children had escaped. Perhaps a daughter had survived. Perhaps Alexei had been removed before the final moment. For the surviving Romanovs, such stories were almost unbearable. They offered hope, but it was a hope without proof, cruel enough to keep grief from becoming final. Then the truth emerged. Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children had not simply disappeared. They had been executed together. The fall of the monarchy had become the destruction of a family. For Olga, grief arrived tangled with memory. Every warning dismissed. Every conversation softened to avoid confrontation. Every chance to act before the prison doors closed. She could blame Nicholas for refusing to see the danger, Alexandra for deepening the isolation, the revolutionaries for carrying out the killings, foreign rulers for failing to offer refuge, and relatives for hesitating when urgency mattered most. But blame could not return a single life. The killings carried a colder purpose. The imperial family had not been destroyed only as individuals. Their deaths were meant to prevent any living Romanov from becoming a symbol around which restoration might gather. Even their remains were concealed, denying relatives the certainty of burial and the mercy of farewell. Olga was left to guard what survived: memory. She had to separate Nicholas, the emperor, whose choices had helped create catastrophe, from Nicholas, the brother she had loved. Neither truth erased the other. And being the sister who had seen it coming brought no comfort. It became a lifelong punishment, the knowledge that she had recognized the danger, spoken of it, feared it, and still failed to alter its course. Olga survived the destruction of her dynasty, but survival carried its own punishment. She would spend the rest of her life guarding a truth the world preferred to turn into legend. Olga escaped the fate of her brother, but she never escaped the Romanov story. In exile, surrounded by memories of a family transformed into myth, she carried the secret burden of the survivor, knowing the dynasty had not fallen in a single moment, but through years of warnings no one wanted to hear. Her escape from revolutionary Russia did not feel like freedom. It felt like being cut loose from everything that had once defined her. Titles offered little protection. Family connections became uncertain. The woman born into imperial ceremony now faced displacement, dependence, and the practical demands of survival. Yet Olga adapted in ways many relatives could not. She lived modestly, worked with her hands, and found dignity outside royal privilege. That simpler existence revealed something important. She had never fully belonged to the artificial world of the court. Its extravagance had always troubled her, just as its emotional distance had prevented the Romanovs from understanding the nation beneath them. But the past followed her. Claimants appeared, insisting they were children of Nicholas who had somehow escaped. Each story reopened a wound Olga could never completely close. She faced them with skepticism, but beneath that caution remained a painful trace of hope. To believe a false survivor, however, would not rescue the dead. It would replace the children she remembered with a comforting invention. So, Olga became a reluctant guardian of truth, defending her family's memory from opportunists, political agendas, and legends designed to make tragedy easier to accept. What then had she truly seen coming? Revolution? Abdication? Murder? Perhaps her warning was larger than any single event. Olga understood that power becomes most fragile when rulers confuse silence with loyalty and tradition with permanence. Her warnings failed because they struck at the dynasty's deepest emotional bonds. Nicholas could not separate duty from devotion to Alexandra. Alexandra could not separate political judgment from fear for Alexei. The family could not imagine that sacred authority might vanish because they had always believed it permanent. Olga's survival did not mean she escaped the catastrophe. It made her responsible for carrying its truth after almost everyone else was gone. The Romanov downfall had not been inevitable when she first sensed the danger. But every warning ignored narrowed the path to safety, until collapse no longer seemed like one possible ending. It became the only ending anyone had left behind.